es sobre la formación académica en museología en América Latina y el Caribe. But I'm supposed to make a short introduction about that topic in order to speak about the academic training in the world, as Olga asked me, and then of course I will let the floor to Olga Nazor, who will introduce the topic briefly. So I would like first to remind you a couple of dates of moments. First moment is linked to the creation of the very first training sessions and courses. 1882 is the creation of the École du Louvre, that was supposed to be, at the first moment, a school for curators. That was proved to be not actually a school for curators, but especially a school for history of art and for people, well-educated people, I would say. 1889, which was the creation of the Museums Association, the UK Museum Association, as Karen reminded us in this morning, and 1906, the creation of the American Association of Museums. 2 years later, the very first courses devoted to museum work training, especially in science museum actually. These were the very first beginnings. I would say that the real beginning of the museum study courses started in the period between after the First World War and before the Second World War. 1922, the creation of Cours de Museographie in Rio de Janeiro. Or 22 for Brno, 10 years later. You know, I was even sure that it was earlier, but maybe they were already thinking about it. In Brno in 22, in Rio in Brno in 22, in Rio in 32. And actually between that moment, it was exactly the same effervescence, full of creation of courses in the US. Of course, the courses with Jenkins and Dana, Paul Sachs, etc., we were already speaking about, but also a lot of other ones. And it's actually at that moment, during the beginning of the 30s, that there were some real courses of museography called the Museographie at the École du Louvre. And at that moment, it was the only place, as it seems, in France where museography was taught. Then, of course, the third moment during the 60s, with the starting of, in 1963 and 4, of, again, the Brno School, which Zbigniew Stransky. 1966, the inauguration of the Leicester School. And then, 1970, the first course of Georges-Henri Rivière in Paris 4. That might be considered as, of course, the beginning of the period we are now facing somehow. It's because, and it's between of these moments, this early creation, and especially the 90s, that everything started to emerge, especially with the evolution of the museum phenomenon during the 80s. The creation, of course, of a lot of blockbusters, but also, among other, the multiplication of museums during the 80s. And with this multiplication, a lot of new departments. 1987, creation of the course in Université de Québec à Montréal and Université de Montréal, la maîtrise. 1990, creation of Institut National du Patrimoine, and at the end of the 90s, for instance, in France, there was something like 50 training linked with museum studies, museology, etc. Of course, some of them were more central than the other ones. For instance, in Saint-Étienne and after Saint-Étienne in Avignon. And of course, also exactly at the same moment, a lot of other courses in museum studies emerged in the UK and in a lot of other countries. Actually, it's very interesting from that moment to see the link between the museum training program, or of course the schools of museum studies or museology, and the number of museums that increased. And this link between the increase of the museum and the increase of the need to train museum professionals, you could also observe it with all of the other countries. In Brazil, it was a bit later, but as of course there were already some very old and first pioneering courses, actually it's exactly at the same moment where you had a kind of explosions of the number of museums in Brazil, that you had also reformation of the museum system and the training system. And it might be also actually the same, for instance, in countries such as China, of course not in the 90s, but during the years 2010 and later. So, the point is, how could we categorize all of these different training centers and academic training centers? Well, of course, it was already said during the morning, you have an important difference, and I would say even a position between, of course, courses devoted more to theory and courses devoted to what could be said as museum work or museum practice. But actually, of course, this opposition does exist, and it has always existed. But it should not be the only possibility to explain the landscape of museum training centers. Actually, if you just think about museum theory, you have also two different possibilities. The first that was, of course, followed by the Brno School with Zbigniew-Stransky, and then later on with other important thinkers such as Ivo Maurevic in Croatia, or even Peter Van Menschel at the Rijnmond Academy, was to form, and of course also in Brazil, in Rio, was actually also to think about the creation of an own discipline of museology. I mean, museum theory should be specific and designated from the inside, I would say, to study the museum, which is totally different from other perspectives. For instance, of course, there were also a lot of theories involved in Leicester, but these were not specific theories linked and that could be called museology. At that moment, during the 80s, it was definitely linked with cultural studies and what was supposed to be called the French theory, such thinkers as Foucault, etc. Before, all of these theories were much more linked with art history and history. And even before, in the 19th century, actually the real term of museology was linked with archaeology. And museology, well, museography was a discipline linked with archaeology, and museology was linked with museography on the beginning of the 19th century, actually. So on one side, during the 90s, you had the cultural studies that were definitely a very important source of influence for the museum sector, the museum studies sector. On the other hand, especially for instance in France, but also for instance in Croatia and in other countries, what would we call in France sciences de l'information et de la communication, information science or communication science, were a very active way of thinking museums. And until now, for instance, museology in France is linked with sciences de l'information et de la communication, which is linked in the scientific system that is used in the academic system in France. So, what would be also now some new categories of I would say, influential disciplines changed a bit. Because since, I would say, maybe the beginning of the year 2000, some other disciplines such as post-colonial studies or gender studies influenced also a lot what would be called as new theory as a whole. Then there is also another possibility of categorizing these different trainings, because there are some specific training that really rely on outside theories, I would say, and some other ones that try to focus on a theory built from the inside of the museum world, I would say. Then it would be also interesting to add a last point, which would be called, I would say, the values behind museum world and behind the museum work. When I speak about values, I would say that, of course, if we take all of these different trainings in Great Britain, in Czechoslovakia during, for instance, the transit period, in United States, etc., or even actually in United States during the Paul Sachs period that we were talking about in the morning, and now in other very modern training, we know that, of course, the level of information, but also the value behind the museum work were totally different. I would propose just to see the things from the functions that were supposed to be the most important ones, and that were valuing some specificities of the museums. We know the PRC model that was launched by the Renoir Academy, Preservation, Research and Communication, as the three main functions of the museum. And actually, just by thinking about this model, there were definitely some museums and museum training centers that focused more on one of these functions. A lot of trainees, for instance, National du Patrimoine, were focusing definitely on preservation, which means that they were definitely also valuing objects, collections, before all of the rest, which was definitely not the case for instance, the course that was launched by Georges-Henri Rivière, and of course of Zbigniew Stransky, or before him, Jelino Stupny in Prague, that were valuing much more research, for instance. Research was seen during the 70s as really the centrum also of the museum, much more than now, which means that on that possibility, if you focus more maybe on research, and of course in scientific museums, for instance, in science museums during the 19th century, the museum was seen as a research center, much more before an organization dedicated to tourism or even to people. Of course, you have a totally different perspective and different values behind that. In the name of research, or in the name of collections, or in the name of the public, you may have totally different possibilities of seeing museum training. And of course, the revolution, maybe the last revolution that could be linked with the Nouvelle Museologie, the French Nouvelle Museologie, or Nueva Museología. Sí, claro. Of course, you had definitely this radical change of value, seeing the public as the centrum, and of course the collection as a periphery. And definitely all of the courses, all of the curriculum was changed because of that. Which means that just by focusing not on only on theory is certainly not a possibility of having a clear view of all of the landscape of museum training. But it should be also necessary to investigate this question of value in order to deliver a kind of museum training. But we know also that all of these values coexist. They do not coexist the same way in the same countries, and even in the same country, they do not coexist exactly the same way in the different trainees, which means and which explains, of course, the variety of the museum training courses and all of the courses that we are going to see in América Latina and in Caribe. This is the point.
Muchas gracias, François, por tu panorama general. En realidad, cuando pensamos en cuál sería el tema central para debatir entre ICOFOM LAM y ICOFOM sin duda se nos ocurrió que el tema de la capacitación en museología y básicamente en teoría museológica sería el más indicado. Y esto porque tengo que remitirme a algunas cuestiones del último trienio del trabajo de ICOFOM LAM. Y es en este sentido, cuando en 2014 diseñamos la estrategia de trabajo, pensamos que vamos a poner el foco en aquellos que son los objetivos del ICOFOM. Y de hecho, difundir la teoría museológica es uno, tal vez el preliminar, es nuestro métier. Por lo tanto dijimos, ¿en qué aspecto? ¿A quién? ¿Cuál va a ser nuestro destinatario, nuestro target? Y pensamos obviamente en quienes coexisten en la práctica del museo. Esto es, pusimos a los profesionales formados por un lado y a todo el espectro de profesiones, actividades, saberes y prácticas que confluyen. Entonces el tema que se nos ocurrió fue, hagamos breves seminarios de teoría museológica en museos, en foros o donde se nos permita para difundir la teoría sobre aquellos profesionales o saberes, sobre aquellas personas que se desempeñan en los museos pero que desconocen. Muchas personas que trabajan en los museos en otras profesiones desconocen que hay una teoría museológica, que hay una museología como tal. De hecho, a veces nos lo preguntan en la práctica de una manera casi asombrosa, ¿sí? ¿Hay museología? Entonces, así fue como comenzó. Estuvimos 2 años dando estos seminarios, los llamamos seminarios de alfabetización en teoría museológica, porque obviamente no tenían que ver con una capacitación del personal formado en museología, tenían que ver en expandir este saber en los otros profesionales, a los otros saberes. Obviamente, ¿qué hicimos? Vamos a tomar a profesores de diferentes universidades de la región que tengan a cargo las cátedras de museología, y así lo fuimos haciendo, y así tuvimos la necesidad de investigar cuáles universidades de la región tenían teoría museológica, a quién acudir, a quién preguntar, si querían ser favorables a este proyecto y demás. De hecho, tuvimos bastante aceptación por parte de los colegas, pero hubo un punto en que nos dimos cuenta que no en todos los ejes académicos, no en todas las currículas de enseñanza de la museología teníamos teoría museológica. Entonces tuvimos que hacer un poco la tarea al revés. ¿Qué está pasando? ¿Qué está pasando en los centros de formación de nuestra región con la enseñanza de la museología teórica? ¿Cuáles son los balances entre aquellos aspectos que refería también François, de los saberes de la museología orientados a las prácticas y a las diferentes expertise, referidos al balance de cantidad, por decirlo así, de teoría museológica que abordaran las currículas? Entonces hicimos una pequeña investigación ad hoc, usamos los recursos que nos provee ICOFOM, solicitándoles sencillamente a nuestros colegas, por favor, dime, ¿en qué universidades da? ¿Quiénes son los docentes? ¿Cómo se da y de qué manera? Por lo tanto, lo que ahora les voy a remitir es el informe de una reunión ad hoc sobre el estado de los estudios académicos en museología que se imparten en nuestra región. Y esto es el producto de la generosidad de los colegas de la familia ICOFOM LAM, a quienes hemos consultado, y no responde a una investigación académica, es sencillamente la recopilación de información. No tenemos información de todos los países que conforman la región, por lo tanto nos centraremos en una muestra de 12 países. Esto no incluye las instancias de capacitación online, sería inabordable para este propósito. Por lo tanto, existen en la región carreras formales de museología del primer tercio del siglo XX, siendo las pioneras Brasil, Argentina y México. Encontramos que desde 1920 Argentina tuvo unos intentos espasmódicos de cursos sistematizados, pero solo fueron consolidados a partir de la década del 50 a través de la Universidad de Buenos Aires y la Universidad del Museo Social Argentino. En el caso de Brasil, en la Universidad de Río de Janeiro funciona desde 1932 la carrera de grado más antigua de Sudamérica. Entre las décadas de 1970 y 80 se estructuraron las carreras técnicas terciarias, de las que luego emergerían las licenciaturas de museología. Las carreras de posgrado a partir del año 2000 aproximadamente. No obstante estos antecedentes, la realidad es que estamos en una región donde un número considerable de países no disponen de capacitación académica en museología, y el acercamiento a los sectores específicos se obtiene ya sea mediante diplomaturas breves de cursos cortos fomentados a través de alguna institución cultural del Estado o por invitación de especialistas generalmente orientados a la praxis, opciones todas de escaso contenido en teoría museológica. Hay casos en estos países en que la teoría museológica como asignatura se dicta en otras carreras como arquitectura, arte e historia, suelen tener teoría museológica como materia, o también, como el caso, por ejemplo, de la Universidad Mayor de San Andrés en Bolivia, que dicta museología teórica en un semestre en la carrera de bibliotecología. En estos países, las personas que se han formado en estudios específicos superiores lo han hecho mediante ofertas del exterior, principalmente en España, Estados Unidos, Canadá y Francia. Países sin estudios formales, tenemos Panamá, Guatemala, Bolivia, Haití, El Salvador y Paraguay, dentro de la muestra que hemos obtenido. Referido a las tecnicaturas, entre los años 70 y 80 proliferaron las tecnicaturas en museología, constituyendo este nivel el más frecuente y el de mayor volumen en la región. Es por un momento, en un significativo porcentaje de países, el único nivel al que puede accederse. Los contenidos de teoría museológica que se identifican en algunos diseños curriculares refieren, en líneas generales, a la historia de los coleccionismos, al análisis y desarrollo del concepto de museo, análisis de algunas cartas y recomendaciones de ICOM y UNESCO, a la historia de la museología local, a los pioneros locales y a la historia de los museos locales. Países con tecnicaturas vigentes: Venezuela, Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, Cuba, Brasil, Colombia y México. Respecto a las licenciaturas en museología, que es título universitario de 5 años de duración con teoría museológica como materia y con duración de 3 cuatrimestres. También en algún terciario de Argentina se dicta teoría museológica 3 cuatrimestres al año. 3 cuatrimestres, perdón. Y esto lo poseen Cuba y Argentina, al menos en la muestra que hemos identificado, por favor. Respecto a los posgrados, creados en su mayoría a partir de los años 2000, se cursan en Chile, Argentina, Brasil, Perú, Venezuela, Colombia y Cuba. Respecto al doctorado, tenemos conocimiento de un solo doctorado en la Universidad de Río de Janeiro, el primero en Sudamérica, creado en 2001, y que lleva una promoción de 20 doctores, con lo que podemos decir que Brasil lidera la formación académica en museología, al menos en el sur de la región. Estimados todos, en ICOFOM LAM consideramos que la orientación eficaz hacia el cumplimiento de los propósitos de ICOFOM, ICOFOM LAM, referidos a investigación, estudio y difusión de las bases teóricas de la museología como disciplina científica independiente, solo podrá cumplirse mediante el conocimiento de los programas y los niveles académicos de capacitación específica en museología en cada país, para de este modo idear estrategias que lleven los problemas, que nos lleven a identificar estos problemas. Conscientes con ello, el año pasado, en el encuentro ICOFOM LAM de Ouro Preto, Brasil, establecimos una mesa de debate sobre los contenidos de teoría museológica en las currículas de los programas del máster en museología. Allí lo aprovechamos porque, al ser en una universidad, en la Universidad de Ouro Preto, pudimos armar una mesa redonda interesante con 8 profesores del máster. Y en un cruce de opiniones y un debate donde también estaban presentes otros profesionales formados, estudiantes de los diferentes niveles, pudimos dialogar entre todos sobre la necesidad de que, al menos en los estudios superiores, se dé teoría museológica como parte fundamental de la currícula, con el propósito de instalar el tema para su tratamiento en los foros académicos. Creemos que, como Comité de la Museología de la región, este es el lugar que nos toca. Dentro de nuestros objetivos está seguir estableciendo contactos con las diferentes universidades y establecer como agenda permanente la discusión de estos temas en cuanto tengamos lugar y oportunidad posible. Esto es todo. Muchas gracias.